probably in the first wave. I mean, she was making chocolate here in the early 2000s, and there were a few other chocolate makers starting around that time. You guys probably heard of Mass Brothers. They got a lot of attention, and then they got a lot of negative attention for not maybe making all the chocolate that they said they were making. But we kind of saw, you know, at that point in 2012, 2013, there were a few others that were popping up. There was Dandelion, which was out in San Francisco, French Broad Chocolate in Asheville, and we sort of saw that this was happening. It made a lot, and you know, we knew Atlanta also. We knew Atlanta was a big foodie. The foodie culture in Atlanta had really been growing. I'm from Atlanta originally. I grew up here, and you know, from about the aughts on, like there was a lot more attention to food than there had been in the 90s. And you know, with the farmers market scene and the more chef-driven restaurants, it just felt like this was a space that was open, because at that point Cacao Atlanta had already kind of their focus wasn't so much on the chocolate. They were doing confections and things, and they were kind of getting a little bit away from where we felt the space was to really focus on the chocolate as itself and single origin bars, and then you know, we added flavor inclusions, and it's very similar, I think, to coffee, like third wave coffee. You know, there was that idea that not all coffee tastes the same, that idea that not all chocolate tastes the same. We thought there was a space there.
Awesome. I would see like you focus in your branding as a small batch company. Why is that?
Well, mostly just because we were. I mean, we still are. I think we kind of, the naming of a company. I mean, we probably picked the worst possible name, and we've gone back and forth, and we've changed the pronunciation slightly. We originally were kind of Xocolatl. Now we're trying to get it in more to Xocolatl, which is maybe a little bit more correct pronunciation. It comes from the Nahuatl, which is the Mesoamerican language, and the word means bitter water, which is the drink that how cacao was consumed for hundreds of years, which is basically cacao ground down in water, cornmeal, peppers, and spices, and it was called bitter water. And anyway, sorry, that's a diversion. But the small batch, I think it brings attention to the fact that we're paying attention to each batch, that we're paying attention to the flavor. We're not trying to create a uniform chocolate flavor across everything. We're going for the nuance in our 70% Peruvian bar that just has cacao and cane sugar in it tastes different than our 70% Nicaragua that just has cacao and cane sugar. And it's from the bean, but then also how we roast the bean, how long we grind the bean, those things affect the flavor. And I think so the small batches kind of speaks to that.
After you signed the first contract with Kroger, did you sleep that night?
To be honest, I mean, we had 2 young kids, and I didn't really sleep. I mean, there were about 6 years where I didn't really sleep. I still don't really sleep very well.
You know, from coming from the food industry, you know, like you have a space, but then you need to make it, you know, licensed. So there's a lot of work. How did you handle it? We were fortunate with our neighbors we lived in Studioplex at the time, which is right around the corner, and our neighbors there were a young couple that were interior designers, and he had an architecture license, and so we were friends with them, and so they helped us design the space, and kind of we couldn't afford a real architect, and we couldn't afford to have an expediter to help you with all the permits and stuff. Fortunately, I had some experience with city government, but I spent a lot of time down at City Hall in the permitting office. I would take the stuff down myself and they'd tell me to fix something, and I'd have to go back and get it fixed. And I made probably 30 trips to City Hall to get the permitting done. We built a lot of our equipment ourselves. We couldn't afford a lot of, there's some equipment that we couldn't build ourselves, we had to buy. We borrowed money from, if anybody knows Invest Atlanta, I highly recommend getting in touch with them. You have to be inside the city, but they have a lot of loan programs and even grant programs for businesses to purchase equipment. And
also to do real estate improvements and things like that. So we had a loan from Invest Atlanta, and we had, through a friend, met a graphic designer. So instead of hiring a graphic design firm, we just worked with one independent graphic designer who was great. And we went and spent 8 months with her developing kind of the whole look of the packaging, which I really think packaging is as important as the product. I mean, I think we all want to feel like, especially if you're doing like craft food, I think you really want to feel like the food should speak for itself, but it doesn't. Like the package speaks for the food. And I think if we had done lesser packaging, there's a chance we may not even be in business today. And so, yeah, we really spent like all of 2014, half of 2013, all of 2014, just working on packaging, the space layout, getting financing for equipment. And we knew that, I mean, from the beginning, we knew we couldn't afford 2 spaces. We couldn't afford like a retail space and a production space. And we thought, we're selling $10 chocolate bars that people are gonna think of as $10 chocolate bars, that nobody in Atlanta is doing that. Who's gonna buy, how are we gonna tell the story of why this chocolate bar costs $10? Well, if we make the chocolate right there, people can smell it, they can see it, and it's like a learning experience. People can we can do education. We can basically educate people why they should spend $10 on a chocolate bar while they're standing there. And so for that, and for just the financial constraints we had, was why we kind of had the production and the retail kind of right there.
Do you remember your first customer?
I think we kind of think of it as like the Inman Park Festival. I do remember, so we also did a Kickstarter campaign, and I do remember it was crazy. The Kickstarter campaign, I was not expecting to go as well as it did. And, I figured it would just be like some friends and family, but I think we got like put onto the Kickstarter homepage at one point, and then we started getting people from all over the country. And then we realized that we'd never shipped a bar of chocolate, and that's actually tricky to do, especially in the summertime. But I do remember when we first opened at Krog, I remember there was a couple that came in. This was within like a day or two of opening, and they had been like a Kickstarter support from out of state. They were from, I don't remember what's like Michigan or something. And I think they just happened, I don't think they came to Atlanta to see us, but they happened to be in Atlanta and they came by, and it was just very cool to see these just random couple that supported our Kickstarter campaign that showed up at the shop. So
I was focusing and then I forgot my question, but yeah, I see like one of the things that you do perfectly is your sustainability sourcing. So
yeah, well, I wouldn't say perfectly. I think that it's hard to run any type of business and to try to make it sustainable both to the climate and to people and just the environment in general. One of the things that drew us to chocolate making initially was that it aligned, a lot of the issues around chocolate aligned with things that Elaine and I had done in our previous work and kind of progressive causes. There's tremendous inequity in the supply chain. So there was an article in the New York Times a couple days ago about, I think it was in Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana. Most of the cacao in the world comes out of West Africa. Like 70% of it comes from like Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. And the farmers there make pennies a day, literally. Well, maybe not literally. They make dollars a day. And they're talking about this one guy who the market price for cacao right now in Ghana, either Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire, is like 77 cents a pound, which is ridiculous. And he had to sell at half price because he needed medicine. So he sold 100 pounds of cacao at like 35 cents a pound, something like that. And that's just not that's not sustainable for anybody. It's not sustainable for the farmers, and just on another level, it's not sustainable. There's not going to be chocolate in the world if farmers aren't paid to grow the cacao. And it's an incredibly labor-intensive process. It takes the trees 5 years to start producing fruit. Once they start producing fruit, there's the harvesting has to be done by hand. You can't mechanize it. You have to cut the pods open, take the seeds out. They're covered in pulp.
there's a fermentation process that happens. That's a 2-week long process. It takes somebody working the fermentation boxes. Sorry, that's about a 1 week long process, but somebody's working the fermentation boxes like every day. Beans have to be turned over from one box to the next. There's a 2-week drying process where someone's going to be out there raking the beans to dry the beans. If it's going to rain, the beans have got to get covered. Just like very labor intensive process before it even gets to us to start turning it into chocolate. And so one of the things we knew was from the beginning was we wanted to work as much as possible directly with the farmers and pay at a minimum fair trade prices, but we pay above fair trade prices for all of the beans that we're purchasing. So that was important to us. There's an environmental aspect to growing cacao too. Cacao comes from the Amazon rainforest. It's grown all over the world now within 20 degrees of the equator, but it's grown in areas that have sensitive forests. These are the forests that are like the lungs of the world, that are burning, that are being clear cut for cattle, for palm oil. And cacao is actually, if we're gonna have human activity in rainforests, cacao is like probably the one good crop that we could do, because it itself is a tree, but it's also grows best with shade trees. And so you have cacao farm, it's not just like clear cut like banana or pineapple or palm. You've got cacao trees growing, you've got bigger old hardwood trees grow to create shade for the cacao trees. Creates better, there's a canopy for wildlife, and there's more carbon sequestration happening. So that appealed to us also, trying to find ways to support sustainable activity. And so we traveled to Peru, Nicaragua. We buy directly from a cooperative that we got in touch with. Actually, if anyone's familiar with Cafe Campesino, they're based in South Georgia. What's the city? Down near Jimmy Carter. But they do amazing work. They're one of the early kind of direct trade coffee importers. They started Co-op Coffee, which is now a really large co-op of coffee roasters throughout North America, actually, and they buy beans directly from farmers. And they started back in like the early 90s, and they pay above fair trade prices, work directly on the ground, and they actually, Bill Harris is the owner there. We met him early on, and he's like, there's this co-op that we buy coffee beans from. Climate's changing. Coffee and cacao generally grow in the same region. Coffee typically grows a little higher, a little colder. Cacao grows a little bit lower, a little warmer. But in some of these places, as the environment's changing, cacao's kind of growing farther up the hill, and coffee's getting squeezed out a little bit. And so he's like, they've got more cacao. They don't really have the market. They don't really have a connection to like the American craft, market. And so we went down with some other chocolate makers and visited them, and went back 3 or 4 times over the last 6 or 7 years, and started importing beans from there. We work with a former Peace Corps volunteer, actually, who lives in Nicaragua, has lived there for 20 something years, is married to a Honduran woman, and they have a farm in Matagalpa, Nicaragua, and he buys beans from his neighbors, and he pays them well above the market rate. One way that you can do this is, it's just talking about the labor involved in cacao, and so you can buy what's called wet beans. So that's when you buy the beans right as they come out of the pod, before they've been fermented and dried. So you kind of take out that 3-week labor process, but he pays for like the dried price and then a little bit of a premium on top of that. So they're basically not having to do like 3 weeks worth of the work, but getting a better price than they would. But then that allows him to control the fermentation process and kind of have a uniform. The fermentation has a huge impact on the final flavor of the bean, so that allows him to kind of control the process and have a good, consistent flavor. And so we work directly with him, and we're too small to buy a container load of beans on our own, but we work with French Broad Chocolate, which is up in Asheville, Rocket Chocolate is up in Brooklyn, Parliament Chocolate is out in California, and so we've all kind of gone to these places together, and we'll buy a container load, get it into the States, and then break it up once it gets here. And then in East Africa, we work with, we buy beans in Uganda and Tanzania, and we buy those through, they're sort of directly through the farmers.
they're basically two social enterprises that are set up. Both of them run by former Peace Corps volunteers, kind of independent of each other, where they have put together essentially a collective of farmers. I think it's about 1,000 small family farmers in Tanzania, and similarly in Uganda, and they're collecting the beans in each place to do central fermentation and drying, and we're buying directly through them, and those farmers are all getting about 30% above the market rate that they would normally be able to get for their beans. So that's what we're trying to do, and I think that's generally what craft chocolate makers, most of craft chocolate makers we've interacted with have similar ethics, values, and are interested in doing that kind of work. So
I'm sure your customer value these.
Some do, some don't. We try to tell the story, and I think storytelling is really important, and it can be hard because that took me 5 minutes that was a lot of rambling you just listened to, and there's a lot of nuance involved in all of this, and it's really hard to communicate that on like a wrapper or even on a website, but it's the stuff that we're interested in. And then there's another sustainability component that's about here in the States and our staff and our environmental impact also. And so we started a healthcare program for our staff a couple of years ago. We're still very small. I think I've noticed that people think we're bigger than we are. We're not that big, but we started a healthcare program, started doing paid time off for staff. Been trying to keep up with paying a livable wage, which has gotten harder and harder to do over the last couple of years. And then there's the component of like packaging. We're buying paper for our wrappers from French Paper Company, which is actually not in France. I think it's in Michigan, but it's like a 100-year-old paper mill, and they have a hydroelectric. They have their own hydroelectric power. Their factory is located on a river, generate their own hydroelectric power that powers the entire factory. We're using recycled paper. They produce so much electricity at this factory they actually power part of the town that they're adjacent to, and so we have been buying our paper from them. And then in terms of our carbon footprint, this is sort of a work in progress over the last like 2 or 3 years. One of our first employee, our first chocolate maker, he's not with us anymore now. He went to Georgia Tech for an environmental studies program there, and we had him come back and do a life cycle analysis for us. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with what the concept of a life cycle analysis, but it's basically you look at all of the inputs that you need to make your product: ingredients, packaging, the shipping of the ingredients and shipping of the packaging, and you calculate the carbon that is emitted for each of those steps in the process, and then you add it up, and then that's your carbon footprint for what it takes to make a chocolate bar. And so we got in touch with the co-op in Peru. How many trucks do you guys have? How far do you drive? In Nicaragua and Tanzania and Uganda, we got in touch with the paper mill, and we figured out shipping and everything. And this was a long process that he did as kind of his thesis for his program. And so we've got like a rough estimate now of like how much carbon is emitted to make a Xocolatl chocolate bar. And so now our next step is like, how do we offset that? And so there's a couple of easy things you can do just to start with. Georgia Power, so we have to also calculate like how much electricity what's our manufacturing footprint. 85% of it is going to be the electricity that you consume, that your equipment uses. Georgia Power has a program called Simple Solar, and you can pay, it's incredibly cheap, which makes me really skeptical that it's doing what it says it does, but you basically pay something like a penny. It's either 10 cents or a penny. I think it's a penny extra per kilowatt hour, and you're buying renewable energy credits to offset the power that you consume. So renewable energy. You can cut me off anytime because I'll keep talking about stuff for a long time. A renewable energy credit is power produced by a solar plant, a wind plant, a hydroelectric plant that is accounted for, and then we're basically buying a piece of that that can't then be sold to somebody else. And so the idea is you're creating demand for renewable energy. If once all that power is bought up, there's going to be demand for another hydroelectric plant or more solar panels. And so, so we, for both our shop and our factory, we do 100% renewable energy credits for those. And then we purchase carbon credits through Pachama, which is an organization that runs different carbon credit programs throughout the world. And if you're interested, it's Pachama, PHCHAMA.org, I think. And you can purchase carbon credits on there. And then we've also started doing carbon capture. So carbon credits, the way those work is you've got a program to protect rainforests. And so they estimate, so you've got cattle ranching happening over here and it's encroaching into the rainforest. And we want to stop that encroachment from happening to protect the carbon capture that the forest is doing. So we're going to incentivize the people in this area to not do cattle ranching. We'll pay them to plant more trees or to do projects that don't cut down trees, make a living in another way. And so, and then you calculate, all right, how much carbon was captured because of that, and then you pay for the program, and it's similar to the renewable energy credits. So, so that's carbon credits. Now, carbon capture is like new technology that they're working on, where you're literally sucking carbon dioxide out of the air. And so there's Climeworks has a project in Iceland where they literally have these huge fans and they suck the air through. They can pull the carbon dioxide out of the air, they put it in the water, they pump it into the ground, and in Iceland there's a ton of basalt rock, and the carbon in the water interacts with the basalt rock and it crystallizes, and so you're not even there's no chance of it releasing, it just turns into carbonite basically, or carbon rock. So
these activities are great, but is it adding like cost and time for like a small business?
Yeah, absolutely. But I will. So I spent a lot of time talking about that, and I know that's probably not what you were expecting to hear. But I think it's just important to me and to Elaine, and so it's something that we care about. But I also think that the part we haven't done a good job about yet is communicating that. And I think that our next step is incorporating this into our packaging and into our website. And I think that customers more and more care about these things, and they do want to know. I think particularly with the summer, there's crazy heat waves happening in Europe. It's like a tropical rainforest down here right now. People can sense that things are going off the rails, and I think people are looking for brands that care, and so I hope so. So our next step is to try to incorporate this.
Actually, now some retailers will not accept you if you don't have like a carbon program.
Yeah. We've talked to Delta. We've been talking to Delta a little bit for the last year, and the Whole Foods and other. And yeah, I can say that people are more and more interested in having brands that can say that they are doing those things.
I know you want to show us something because I want to go to the growth.
Yeah.
Some question about the growth. You want us to show us your videos now?
Yeah, I can just kind of run through. This is some of the stuff I've already probably talked about. I'll just kind of quickly show you guys a little bit of. So these are cacao pods, which is the inspiration for the colors in our wrappers. So we really, you're so used to seeing, I don't know, I felt like very used to seeing like brown chocolate wrappers, like Hershey's, like everything's just brown, and it's like, well, chocolate is actually a fruit. It comes from a fruit. It's very colorful. So we kind of took the pod colors as inspiration for our packaging. And then this is how it grows on the tree. So cacao trees produce thousands of these little flowers, and only about 5-6% of them actually turn into pods that have the seeds
what we call cocoa beans, are actually the seeds of this fruit. And that's what it looks like on the inside. So you chop that open, the seeds are covered in this pulp, and the pulp's really important because that is what provides the sugar for the fermentation process that happens. And so that's a raw bean, kind of out, it's a little bit out of focus actually, but that's a raw bean out of a pod. It's usually they're a really purpley color. This is actually what's called a criollo, which is a more rare type of cacao that it has these white beans out of the pod. Then when you roast it, it becomes brown again, but a lighter kind of brown, and it's a kind of a more prized sort of flavor. But they grow weird. I mean, they grow on the tree trunks, they grow on the branches. It's a weird tree, and they come in different shapes. And so these are different varieties. I mean, you can tell by the color, by the shape. This is a kind of fatter, smoother shape. This one is going to have.
They look like pumpkins.
Yeah, they look kind of squash-like. Yeah. This one's kind of more warty, got deeper ridges, longer, elongated, pointier nose. So, like coffee, like wine, grape wine, wine grapes, whatever. Yeah, there's different varieties. They taste different. And this is Elaine climbing a tree. I always put this one just because I think she looks cool doing that. But and then this is the process. So, like I was talking about, the labor involved. Pods get picked, and then you've got to sit there and chop the pods open with a machete. There's no easy way to do this, and then you put the seeds with the pulp into these buckets. This is the co-op in Peru. So this first photo is an individual farm. So there's a couple hundred different farms that are a part of this co-op. They'll open the pods on the farm, then carry the buckets down the road onto a truck or a moto, and then it gets taken to the co-op, and then it gets loaded in these fermentation boxes in the co-op. Beans get, as I said, usually you'll have 4 or 5 boxes, and every 24 to 48 hours the beans get turned over from one box to the next box. So as the microbes in the environment start to eat the sugar, right? Starts the fermentation process, but you got to turn the beans over to try to get even ferment, to add oxygen to the fermentation process also, because at a certain point, if they eat up all the oxygen, they'll start to die. And then this is, what they look like as they're fermenting. Not sure what that one was. This is an old computer, and I don't think the internet's working too well on it. But all right, this might be the end of the slideshow. So this is our shop in blurry mode at Krog Street. But basically, this is front of house, and then that was our factory just behind this little wall. And then we had an oven and a grinder.
I thought this was a very fancy shop, like starting as this as a very good.
Yeah, we really felt like we're selling a high price product. We've got to make it look nice. And so a lot of this is like faux walnut, but, we got a good stain, we got a good walnut stain. We got really lucky in that we happened to know a carpenter who did the counter. It should have cost a lot more than it did. And I think that, the branding and the graphics, helped a lot. And so we would make everything right behind the counter. You can see some of our homemade equipment back here. This is our cracker that we built where you crack the beans. This is the backside of our winnower. So winnowing is this process of, after the beans have been cracked, you've got the shells and the nibs are all mixed together. You got to separate the shells from the nibs. And so it's kind of a Rube Goldberg type of thing with a vacuum hooked up to it. And we send them down the chute, and the vacuum basically sucks the shells over to one side, and the nibs are heavier and they kind of drop down on the other side. And so we have nibs, and then the nibs get loaded into these stone grinders. And this is a video, but I don't think it's going to play. But we load the nibs straight into these grinders, and the
they get broken down, and then the friction heats them up, and then cocoa butter comes from cacao, and so as it heats and gets pulverized, the cocoa butter releases and it just turns into liquid chocolate, and we add sugar to it. This is also a video that's probably not going to play. But this is after it's been in the grinder. So these grinders run 24 hours a day for like 3 or 4 days, and we add the sugar usually after about 24 hours, and then once that, now this is our new space, this is our new winnowing machine. The one I made is a little smaller, and this is the space we're kind of excited about now. We have 2 temporary machines and a melt tank. We used to have to melt our chocolate in the oven, where we also roasted the beans, which was kind of problematic. And then this is where we're roasting. This is my dad in the back wrapping bars. Yeah, that's our operation.
Awesome. Let's go to growth. When did you decide to go to retail?
Well, right off the bat, we thought